The year 1973, the Arab oil embargo had just brought the most powerful economy on earth to its knees. American gas stations have queues stretching around the block. The speed limit on US highways is dropped to 55 miles per hour to save fuel. The stock market loses 45% of its value. Inflation spirals. An entire decade of Western economic confidence evaporates in a matter of months. All because a handful of nations decided to turn off a tap. And the tap was a strait. A 33-kilometer wide waterway at the mouth of the Persian Gulf, the Strait of Hormuz, the single point through which one-fifth of the world's oil had to pass to reach the rest of the planet. Saudi Arabia watched all of this unfold, and unlike most nations that watched, processed, and moved on, Saudi Arabia asked a different question. What happens to us if someone blocks that strait? And then, quietly, methodically, over the next 8 years, they answered it with steel and concrete and 1,200 kilometers of engineering buried beneath the Arabian desert. This is the story of the Petroline, the pipeline that no one talks about, the infrastructure decision that may have been the single most consequential act of strategic foresight in the history of the modern energy system. To understand why the Petroline matters, you need to understand the trap the Saudi Arabia was living in. By the late 1970s, Saudi Aramco was producing somewhere between 8 to 10 million barrels of crude oil per day. The kingdom's entire economic model, its government revenues, its social spending, its development plans, its political stability rested on one thing: getting that oil to market. And getting that oil to market meant one thing: the Strait of Hormuz. Every tanker leaving Ras Tanura, Saudi Arabia's primary export terminal on the Gulf Coast, had to navigate through Hormuz. There is no other way. The Gulf is essentially a semi enclosed sea. It has one exit, and the exit is a narrow channel shared with Iran. Iran, Saudi Arabia's rival, a nation whose relationship with Riyadh had already been complicated before the 1917 Islamic Revolution and became openly hostile afterward. Imagine building your entire national economy on a highway and then realizing that your most dangerous neighbor has a house right at the only exit. That's the strategic position Saudi Arabia found itself in as the 1970s turned it into the 1980s. The question was not whether this was a problem, it obviously was. The question was what to do about it. Some nations would have lobbied, some would have signed treaties, some would have hoped for the best. Saudi Arabia picked up a shovel. In 1981, Saudi Arabia began construction on what would become officially known as the Petroline, the East-West Crude Oil Pipeline. The concept was almost brutally simple. If the problem is a maritime choke point in the east, build a route to the west. If the problem is that every barrel of oil has to exit through one door, build a second door. The pipeline would run from Jubel Abqaiq, the world's largest crude oil processing facility, located in Saudi Arabia's eastern province, westward across the full width of the Arabian Peninsula to the Red Sea port of Yanbu. 1,200 kilometers across some of the most inhospitable terrain on earth, through the desert that reaches 50 degrees Celsius in summer, through a landscape where there are no rivers, no roads in many sections, no infrastructure of any kind. And it would be buried underground, invisible from the air, invulnerable to naval attack by definition, because you cannot sink a pipeline. The original design capacity was 1.85 million barrels per day. It was expanded, then expanded again. By the time it reached its current configuration, the Petroline could move 7 million barrels per day from the Gulf Coast to the Red Sea. To put that in perspective, 7 million barrels per day is roughly 7% of global oil consumption moved through a pipe under a desert, bypassing entirely the strait that had brought the Western world to its knees 8 years earlier. Let's pause here and appreciate what this actually required, because it is easy to say they built a pipeline. It's harder to grasp what that actually means at this scale. The Petroline consists of two parallel pipes. The main crude line, 56 inches in diameter, running the full 1200 kilometers. A second, smaller line running alongside it, 11 pump stations positioned along the route to maintain pressure across the full length. Each pump station is its own self-contained facility. Power generation, cooling systems, control rooms, staff accommodation in the middle of the desert, communication infrastructure connecting every station to a central operations center. The pipeline itself had to be manufactured, transported to some of the most remote locations in Saudi Arabia, welded with precision, tested, buried, and then buried again under protective earthworks in the most vulnerable section. The Red Sea terminal at Yanbu was built from scratch alongside the pipeline. Yanbu Al Bahar, a fishing village before the pipeline arrived, was transformed into an industrial port city. Storage tank farms with capacity for tens of millions of barrels, loading berths capable of handling the largest crude tanker afloat, a full marine terminal with its own navigation infrastructure, and port fleet and port authority. The total cost ran into billions of dollars at 1980s prices. And Saudi Arabia built it anyway. Not because there was an immediate crisis, not because Hormuz had been blocked, but because someone in Riyadh looked at a map, looked at history, and decided that depending on a single exit point for your entire national income was an unacceptable risk. That decision, made in 1981, paid off in 2026. In March 2, a drone strike hits Ras Tanura. Saudi Arabia's primary Gulf export terminal goes offline. The facility that handles hundreds of thousands of barrels per day is suddenly abruptly out of action. Markets spike, analysts scramble. The question everyone is asking is the same question that has hunted energy markets for 5 decades. What happens if Saudi oil stops flowing? The answer came 11 days later. Operations resumed full capacity. 550,000 barrels per day moving through Yanbu. The East-West Pipeline, the pipe that had been sitting quietly under the desert for 44 years, stepped forward and absorbed the shock. No emergency, no rationing, no 1973 replay. Just a pipeline doing exactly what it was designed to do. The engineering worked, the foresight worked, the decision made by planners in 1981 to spend billions building redundancy that might never be needed. turned out to be the one of the best infrastructure investments in the history of the modern energy system. Saudi Arabia had looked at its single point of failure and it had eliminated it. 44 years later, the world barely noticed because the crisis that should have happened didn't. That is what successful infrastructure looks like. Not a ribbon cutting, not a headline, just a system working quietly in the background, observing a shock that no one else felt. So, what is the lesson in the engineering? There is a principle in system design called redundancy. It means building a backup before you need it. It means spending money on a system that you hope will never have to be used. It means accepting a cost today to eliminate a catastrophic risk tomorrow. Most governments struggle with redundancy because redundancy is expensive and invisible. You cannot point to a pipeline that prevented a crisis and say, look at what we built. You can only point to the crisis that didn't happen. And the crisis that didn't happen generates no headlines, no celebrations, no political credit. Saudi Arabia built the Petroline anyway. They spent the money in 1981 when oil markets were volatile, when the construction cost was immense, when there was no guarantee the pipeline would ever be needed. They built pump stations in the middle of empty desert. They created a port city at Yanbu. They ran 1,200 kilometers of pipe across the Arabian Peninsula because the map told them they had to. That is not just engineering, that is governance. That is the kind of long term institutional thinking that separates nations that build resilience from nations that react to crises after they happen. The Petroline is not famous. Most people who follow energy markets cannot tell you when it was built, what its capacity is, and how many pump stations it has. But it may be the single most important piece of infrastructure in the global energy system that nobody talks about. Now let's understand what is the incomplete victory. Here is where the story gets complicated. Because the Petroline solved Hormuz, it didn't solve everything. As I explained in my last video in detail, the oil exits Yanbu, it enters the Red Sea, it must pass through Bab el Mandeb, a strait 29 kilometers wide at its narrowest, to reach global markets heading west. The same Houthi forces that have lost over 100 attacks on Red Sea shipping since 2023. The same proxy network, the same anti-ship missiles with Iranian guidance system, the same economics of disruption, where a 10% hit rate across 100 attacks is enough to reprice an entire shipping corridor for 2 years. Saudi Arabia eliminated one choke point. The crew travels 1,200 kilometers underground across the desert to safety, and then it emerges at Yanbu and faces a different choke point. The bypass is real, the resilience is genuine, the engineering deserves every credit it receives, but the map has not changed. It has only shifted the vulnerability 1,200 kilometers to the west. In 1973, the world learned that geography is not just a subject taught in the schools. It is the operating system beneath the global economy. It determines which nations hold leverage and which nations hold exposure. It decides which economies absorb shocks and which economies transmit them. Saudi Arabia learned that lesson earlier and more clearly than almost anyone. And they responded with one of the most consequential infrastructure decisions of the 20th century. A 1,200-kilometer pipeline buried under a desert, built not for today's crisis, but for future crisis that planners in 1981 could only imagine. The pipeline worked in 2025, exactly as designed, exactly as intended. The lesson is not that Saudi Arabia has solved its geography problem. The Red Sea is still there. Bab el Mandeb is still there. The proxies are still there. The lesson is what happens when nation takes its geography seriously. When it looks at a map, identifies a vulnerability, and commits the resources to address it, not in a response to a crisis, but in anticipation of one. Most nations wait for the crisis, then they react, then they rebuild. Saudi Arabia built the pipe fast. And 44 years later, remember, 44 years later, when the drone came for Ras Tanura, the desert barely noticed. This is the power of engineering.